If you think about it, being born must have been pretty disappointing for Vikings. I mean, you spend 9 months in a dark, cramped space hearing nothing but your mom's heartbeat, only to emerge into a freezing cold, smoky room filled with strangers. No wonder so many of them died. In fact, before a Viking child could even cry properly, life had already decided to punch them in the face. Viking childbirth wasn't some peaceful, candlelit event. It was bloody, terrifying, and often deadly. Women gave birth on straw beds in smoky longhouses, surrounded by worried family and maybe one experienced midwife. If the mother died in childbirth, well, too bad. That happened a lot. And if the baby looked sick, deformed, or weak, the father made the decision. He'd take one look and either pick the baby up, which meant the child was accepted into the family, or he'd walk away. Literally walk away. That meant the baby was exposed. Left outside to freeze, starve, or be eaten by wolves? No one would stop it. No one was expected to. That was the culture. But why? Why were Vikings so, for lack of a better term, brutal? Well, let's just say they were practical. They knew that most of the children born in their village wouldn't survive. Their society was built for warriors, not families. Raiding and pillaging required able-bodied men and women. So, if you weren't strong enough to keep up, you were considered a liability, nothing more than a burden. Your life had little value. And if you were a sickly newborn, you weren't even given a chance. But for those babies who were lucky enough to be accepted, the challenges were far from over. The home was cold, smoky, and full of disease. The baby would be wrapped in animal furs and laid beside the fire, but fires produced smoke. And Viking homes had no chimneys, so that poor newborn breathed in thick smoke all winter long. Lung infections before teething? You bet babies were breastfed if their mothers lived. If not, cow or goat milk was fed from a horn, no formula, no clean bottles, just hope. And more often than not, hope didn't work. Many babies died in their first year, not from war or battle, but from diarrhea, infection, and cold. There was no baby's first birthday unless the gods were feeling generous. But if somehow a Viking child survived that first brutal year, congratulations. You're now ready for an even more exhausting chapter, toddlerhood, Viking style. A small price to pay for their freedom. Now, we can't talk about Viking children without addressing one particularly gruesome aspect of their culture: blood brothers. When a Viking man made a blood brother, it was a sacred oath. The two men would cut deep into their legs and mix their blood together. Then they'd drink some of that blood. It was a sign of trust, loyalty, and everlasting friendship. So naturally, this practice leaked into the way they treated their kids, too. Boys would make blood brothers out of their toys, dolls, or animals. Even a baby could have a blood brother. By letting their child drink their blood, the parent was signing a pact. They would always defend their kids' honor, always stand by their side, and always love them, no matter what. It was an intense, almost violent promise, and while we think it's kind of weird today, it helped forge a strong community of loyal friends and family members. The bond created through the mixing of blood ran deeper than anything these people had known. So overall, would you say it was better to be a Viking warrior or a Viking baby? Let us know in the comments below. And thanks for watching. You've made it past infancy. You didn't freeze to death, didn't choke on goat milk, and your lungs are only partially filled with smoke. Congratulations, little Viking toddler, it's time to get to work. There were no soft toys, no baby swings, and definitely no naptime schedules. Once a child could walk, they were considered useful. And in the Viking world, useful meant start pulling your weight now. At just 3 or 4 years old, Viking children were expected to begin helping with daily chores. This meant fetching water from frozen wells, feeding animals, collecting firewood, and cleaning. And if you didn't do your job properly, well, yelling was the nice outcome. Beatings were more common. Children weren't seen as precious. They were small humans being trained for survival. If they cried, they were told to toughen up. If they were lazy, they were punished. And if they showed fear or hesitation, that was considered shameful, especially for boys. Boys were raised to be warriors, and that training started early. Wooden swords, small shields, and mock fights were part of growing up. It was less play fighting and more learn how to stab before you lose your village. Every mistake could lead to a real injury, and nobody was wrapping you in bubble wrap. Girls weren't off the hook either. They were trained to cook, spin wool, weave clothes, and care for younger siblings. By the age of 5 or 6, they could run a household if needed, not out of fun, out of necessity. And let's not forget that Viking families were huge. Multiple generations lived in the same smoky longhouse, and space was tight. Privacy didn't exist. Children slept wherever there was room, often on the dirt floor, sharing space with siblings, animals, and fleas. Yes, fleas. Because Viking hygiene was, let's just say, very natural. Playtime, if it happened at all, meant carving toys from leftover firewood or pretending sticks were animals. Dolls were made from rags, and games often involved pretending to hunt or fight, because what else was there? Imagination was the only luxury available, and even that didn't last long. Because as Viking children got older, their lives would become more brutal. By age 7, most Viking children had mastered the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. Their education didn't stop at home. The entire community was their classroom. As they grew, they learned about their religion, their history, and their rights and responsibilities. But make no mistake, this was a harsh education. Most lessons were about surviving in a brutal world. And there were very few participation trophies. At age 8, a Viking child's life became more like a young adult's. They helped with everything, including preparing food, making and repairing clothing, and taking care of livestock. When the family had a feast, children were responsible for cleaning the leftovers. They also helped mend broken tools and weapons. And don't think for a second that meant playtime was more fun. A game of throwing rocks became a lesson in hand-eye coordination and accuracy. A game of tag turned into learning how to stalk prey. Hide and seek wasn't about fun. It was about learning how to sneak around without being seen. Every moment was about survival. And it wasn't all chores and training. Viking kids did have some fun, mostly when seasonal festivals rolled around. These celebrations included feasts, drinking, music, dancing, and games. Sometimes the community would hold athletic competitions. These weren't your average kid games. They were full-on practice for adulthood. Boys competed in wrestling, swimming, and javelin throwing. They were even encouraged to fight each other with wooden swords. Meanwhile, girls competed in running, long jump, and discus. It was a time for everyone to show off their skills and maybe get noticed by a potential future husband or wife. Kind of like a job interview, but with more sweating and screaming. So remember, if you were a Viking kid, childhood was rough, it was cold, hard, and dangerous. There was little time for laughter and joy. But as you grew older, you became more capable, more respected, and yes, more likely to die in battle. But hey, at least you knew how to throw a mean javelin. When you imagine a Viking kid, what comes to mind? Maybe a horned helmet or a chubby-cheeked kid with a wooden sword, right? Well, thanks to Hollywood, we've grown up thinking that Vikings were all about war and pillaging. So, of course, their kids would be running around in little armor, too. But the reality was totally different. Forget school bells, chalkboards, or spelling tests. Viking children didn't go to school, they went straight into life. For the vast majority of Viking kids, education was hands-on and usually involved something sharp, reading and writing. That was for the wealthy, noble, or religious elite. Most Viking children couldn't even spell their own names because, well, they didn't need to. They needed to know how to survive. And that meant learning skills like fishing, hunting, fighting, and sailing, and there was no room for slackers. If you couldn't gut a fish by age 7, you were considered useless. If you didn't know how to climb into a longships, you were holding everyone back. So fathers, uncles, and older brothers served as teachers, and they weren't gentle. Discipline was swift, and mistakes could be dangerous. A boy learning how to throw a spear for the first time didn't get a foam dummy, he got a real one. And if he dropped it or tripped, laughter followed by a lecture. Or worse, a slap. Luckily for us, Eva Lynn from He-Man is real. She'd probably rock at Viking parenting. We're just kidding. Mostly, although discipline was important, children also learned through play. Playing with wooden swords and shields wasn't just fun, it was practice for battle. And when the time came, that experience would help them survive against enemies. But a Viking childhood wasn't just about fighting. It was also about getting ready for adulthood. And for boys, that meant becoming a warrior. For girls, it meant learning how to manage food, clothing, and children, basically preparing them to be wives and mothers. So childhood wasn't a carefree time, but a crash course on how to be an adult. And the pressure was intense. Marriage could happen at age 12, so girls had little time to waste. By their teens, most were already wives or mothers. But don't get us wrong, we wouldn't trade it for the world. The chance to raise our own adorable meat cleaver tot is priceless. Just kidding, kind of. Childhood as we know it today didn't really exist in the Viking Age. Once kids were out of the baby stage, they were basically on their own. Sure, mom and dad might have provided some guidance, but it was up to the kids to figure things out. This isn't to say that parents didn't love their children, but the harsh realities of life meant that childhood was more like a few months than a carefree period. For example, most Viking families lived in poverty. Food was scarce and work was hard, so parents couldn't spare much time or energy for playing with their kids. Instead, they relied on older children to take care of the younger ones. But as we mentioned before, those older siblings were busy learning how to survive, so it was up to the eldest to fend for themselves. Not exactly the recipe for happy childhood memories. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Even though life was tough, children did have some opportunities for fun and games. When they weren't working or learning survival skills, kids could enjoy playing with friends, telling stories, or listening to bards. And every now and then they might even get to hear some real stories of Norse gods and heroes. But these weren't the typical fairy tales we know today. Oh no, these were tales of bravery, adventure, and yes, plenty of violence. Still, they provided children with a sense of wonder and excitement that's universal no matter the time or place. And let's face it, even in the toughest of times, kids need a little bit of magic. So while a Viking childhood was far from easy, it was also full of adventure, excitement, and most importantly, the chance to learn and grow. Would you like to know what it was like to be a kid in the Viking Age? Okay, don't answer that. I'm guessing you didn't live back then, so how do you learn about the past? Easy, you watch this channel. We bring history to life so you can explore it from the comfort of your couch. Don't worry, there are no pop quizzes. First, let's talk about the good old Viking axiom. It was all about being prepared. And who was more prepared than the mighty Vikings? They knew how to survive anything. But did they teach these skills to their kids? You bet. The axe was the ultimate tool, useful for everything from building projects to, battle. By the time a Viking child was 10 years old, he or she could throw an axe at a target. Now, don't picture tiny tots wielding axes the size of their heads. More likely, they used smaller axes and wooden practice swords. But hey, the goal was the same, to hit what they were aiming for. At first, they learned basic throws under the watchful eye of adults. No YouTube videos back then, but eventually kids practiced on their own. Maybe they tossed axes while herding animals or waiting for their turn at the dinner table. And when they got good, they showed off. Throwing competitions were a big deal, sort of like the Olympics of axe throwing. Young Vikings loved to boast about their skills. After all, being the best was part of the Viking mentality. Being prepared, being self-sufficient, being strong. These weren't just words for them, they were a way of life. But if the axe throwing didn't wear you down, life itself would. Childhood in Scandinavia was tough. Winter was the worst. Snow piled up, daylight disappeared for months, and homes weren't exactly cozy. Picture drafty, smoky longhouses with dirt floors instead of carpets. Some families had slightly nicer homes, but they were still pretty basic. Most Viking longhouses were just big rectangles with a roof. They were made of wood or stone depending on where you were. Inside was a big open space with a fire pit in the middle. This was the heart of the home. It was also the only source of heat. No central heating back then. If you were lucky enough to sleep near the fire, you might have a raised platform made of wood or stone. But most people slept on straw mattresses or furs on the dirt floor, and no pajamas or blankets as we know them. So most kids probably just wrapped themselves in whatever animal skin wasn't crawling with lice. Then there was the food situation. Let's just say it wasn't five-star hotel dining. In summer, Viking families ate mostly gruel, a kind of porridge made from grain. They also enjoyed bread and dried fish. And if they had goats, they might drink some milk, but often it was easier to get fresh air than fresh food. Meat was rare. Berries, nuts, and fruit were better than nothing. But winter was the worst. Food became scarcer and raiding other settlements was riskier. That meant lots of empty stomachs. Children were the last to eat after the elders and warriors. Even if your job was to stir the pot, you still got the leftovers. And speaking of jobs, kids had lots of chores. They had to help with everything from cooking to cleaning to taking care of animals. And they did all this while half-starved. No wonder they preferred playing outside. There they could use their imaginations. They pretended to go on raids or fight fierce battles. They reenacted the sagas they heard from storytellers. And sure, sometimes they fought each other, but most of the time they just played. And when the sun finally came back, they had new things to look forward to, like fishing or swimming. Life wasn't all bad. But once the temperature dropped, everyone started worrying about survival. That meant less playing and more work. Children had to fetch icy water from rivers, carry wood through the snow, and feed livestock while their fingers nearly froze off. Oh, and no one said thank you. It was expected. You didn't get a gold star, you got more chores. And if that wasn't enough, there were other dangers: sickness, raids, rival clans, wild animals, and even slave traders. To protect themselves, children carried weapons like small axes or wooden swords. But sometimes that wasn't enough. Viking kids could be captured and sold if they wandered too far or were unlucky during a raid. In fact, some historians think that many slaves were children. All this danger meant fear was constant, safety was rare, happiness, well, that was something they heard about in stories. But we can't end this without talking about everyday life. What did Viking children wear? Usually animal skins, maybe some woolen clothes if they were lucky. They didn't have shoes, so they wore nothing on their feet except thick socks. As for bathing, let's just say it wasn't common. Most Vikings bathed maybe twice a year. And no toothbrushes or toothpaste either. They brushed their teeth with sticks. Imagine giving someone a high five with a stick. Yeah, it was that close. Life as a Viking child was tough, but they were prepared. Thanks for watching. Remember to subscribe and leave your comments below. And don't forget to check out our other videos. If you were a kid in the 9th to 11th century, life was probably pretty hard. Back then, in the land we today call Scandinavia, there was a culture known as the Viking. These guys loved three things: pillaging, exploring, and trading. And if you were a Viking child, your life revolved around these activities. Now, some people think that being a Viking was kind of like being a modern-day pirate, and yeah, that's not too far off. In fact, the word Viking actually means pirate or raider. Now, you're probably thinking that sounds super exciting. I bet those guys had fun. Well, yes and no. While it is true that Vikings went on adventures and raided other countries, they also worked really hard as traders and farmers. And you know what? Those jobs are kind of boring. And while a Viking raid could be exciting, life as a Viking wasn't always an adventure. A lot of the time it was just hard work and danger. For example, raids often ended with violence, and violence was a part of everyday life for Vikings. Men, women, and children alike were expected to fight if necessary, and they had to be strong and brave and never show fear or pain. By now, you might think Viking children would at least be allowed to cry a little, just a few tears after all that cold, hunger, and backbreaking work. But no, showing emotion, that was a weakness. And weakness got you mocked, punished, or ignored. Vikings admired strength, courage, and endurance. From a young age, children were taught to hide pain, swallow fear, and never, ever cry in public. Especially boys. If a boy cried, he'd be called soft, useless, or even cursed by the gods. Girls weren't given much room either. Their emotions were seen as distractions from their duties. If a young girl cried about the pressure of being a future wife, mother, and household manager at age 12, well, too bad. She still had to spin yarn, bake bread, and raise her baby siblings before dinner. Children were expected to grow up fast, emotionally and mentally. There were no lullabies to soothe fears. No parenting tips for mental health. Just constant reminders that survival meant being hard. Even play was violent. Children mimicked raids, sword fights, and hunts. Their heroes were warriors like Ragnar or gods like Thor, no fairy tales or happy endings. Just legends filled with betrayal, blood, and frost giants. Discipline was strict. Parents believed in the rod, misbehaving, talking back, falling behind in chores. Expect a slap, a scolding, or worse. Pain was part of learning, and no one questioned it. Love wasn't soft in Viking homes. It was tough, silent, and conditional. Parents showed affection by feeding you, clothing you, and preparing you for a hard world. Hugs were rare. Praise was rarer. So Viking children didn't just suffer physically. They were hardened emotionally, shaped into survivors or casualties. And sadly, many didn't live long enough to become adults. Childhood diseases like measles and smallpox were especially dangerous because adults had no tolerance for weakness. If you got sick, you had to suck it up and keep working. If you couldn't work, you were a burden. Sadly, this is just a small part of the story. Now, remember when I said that Vikings worked hard as traders? Well, the truth is that most Vikings didn't really go on adventures. In fact, only about 2% of Vikings were what we would call today mercenaries or explorers. The rest were farmers or traders. And don't get me wrong, trading can be exciting, but it's not exactly pillaging. And while most Vikings didn't go on raids, they did do some pretty messed up stuff. For example, Vikings believed that if you were born with a deformity, you were cursed by Odin, the god of wisdom. As a result, deformed babies were left out in the forest to die. Also, Vikings made slaves. They'd capture people during their raids and sell them in slave markets. And finally, Vikings practiced a form of trial by ordeal. Basically, if you were accused of a crime, you had to prove your innocence through some really dangerous challenges. Like instead of a lie detector test, you had to put your hand in a pot of boiling water. Yeah, that's right. This was their version of a lie detector test. If your hand came out red and swollen, you were guilty. And if it came out looking normal, you were innocent. I'm pretty sure that's a really inaccurate test. Being a Viking kid was not easy. It was dangerous, hard work. And if you couldn't handle it, you were basically on your own. Sadly, childhood was not a happy time for most Viking kids. Thanks for watching. Bye. This is a presenter from the channel, and you're watching this channel. If a Viking child was lucky and strong enough to survive sickness, cold, hunger, and relentless work, they'd eventually grow up. But becoming an adult in the Viking world wasn't freedom, it was just a new level of misery. By the age of 12 or 13, many Viking children were already married, betrothed, or in battle training. Childhood didn't end with a celebration. It ended with responsibility being thrown at you like a battle axe. For boys, this meant real combat training. You'd go from wooden swords to metal blades. You might be handed a shield taller than you and told to march into mock raids. You'd be expected to defend your home, kill in the name of your clan, and earn glory in battle. And if you hesitated, you'd bring shame on your family. Girls? Many were already wives, often to older men. They were expected to bear children, run households, and serve as the glue that held their extended families together. No time for personal dreams or ambition. Your value was in how many sons you could provide, and how well you could hide your exhaustion. And then there were the realities of war. Boys who became warriors often died in battle before reaching 20. Girls died in childbirth. Both faced high chances of starvation, disease, or dying in a raid. There were no pensions. No retirement, no peaceful endings. Just the constant grind of survival until the gods took you or the world did. So when we imagine Viking children running through meadows or dreaming under the stars, we miss the truth. They were survivors from the start. Hardened, bruised, and expected to endure more than most modern adults ever will. And that is why Viking childhood was anything but a golden age. It was a cold, dangerous test, and most never passed. Now it's no secret that Vikings lived in a harsh world. Their lives were all about survival. And even if you managed to survive into adulthood, life didn't get much easier. But here's the thing, those who made it to adulthood weren't just survivors. They were hardened by their experiences. They grew up fast and they grew up tough. That's why when we talk about the Viking Age, we think of fierce warriors and fearless explorers. But what made them that way? What made them so tough? It all started with their childhood. Let me paint you a picture of what life was like for a Viking kid. Let's say you were born in Scandinavia around the year 800 AD. Your father is a warrior, your mother is a farmer. Life is hard. You don't have a lot of toys or games, but you do have a lot of chores. You're expected to help your mother with the farming. You're expected to take care of the animals. You're expected to help your father with his weapons. And if you're not careful, you'll get hurt. But that's just part of growing up in the Viking world. You learn to be careful, you learn to be tough, and you learn to survive. But it's not just the physical challenges that shape you. It's also the mental challenges. You're constantly aware of the dangers that lurk around every corner, whether it's a wild animal or a rival clan. You learn to be cautious, you learn to be prepared, and you learn to trust your instincts. These are the skills that make you a survivor. As you grow up, you're also expected to play your role in the community. If you're a boy, that means learning how to fight. You learn how to use a sword, how to throw an axe, how to defend yourself and your family. You're also expected to learn how to sail a ship, how to navigate the seas, how to fight on the battlefield. If you're a girl, you're expected to learn how to run a household, how to take care of the children, how to keep the family together. You're the glue that holds everything together. And that's a lot of responsibility for a child, but that's just how it is in the Viking world. But even with all this training, the biggest challenge you face is simply staying alive. The odds are stacked against you. You face disease, famine, war, and the elements. Most of your brothers and sisters won't make it to adulthood. But if you're lucky, you survive. And when you look back, you realize that what made you who you are today was your childhood, your upbringing in the harsh world of the Vikings. It shaped you, molded you, and made you a survivor. It gave you the skills, the knowledge, and the strength to face whatever challenges life throws at you. So let's raise a toast to Viking childhood, a childhood like no other. A childhood that was tough, challenging, but ultimately made you who you are. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe and join our community. And as always, stay tuned for more amazing historical tales. Thank you.